So with the big points cut to 1 and several of their competitors nerfed, the big scary Primaris horror tanks might be coming to the fore once more. Let's talk about the Repulsors and what they bring to the table in Warhammer 40k right now. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Space Marines once more, and in this video I thought we'd talk about the indomitable wall of adamantium and hoverplates that is the Repulsor, and go through both the regular datasheet and the Executioner and what they bring to the table versus the competition. Let's talk through both datasheets, a few interesting ways to support them, and a look at how they're fielded in the competitive game. Miniature wise, the Repulsor kind of feels like Games Workshop was going for a Primaris Hover Land Raider in theme, a similar sort of size and weight class model, a tank that can transport a whole load of models and still brings a bunch of serious firepower to the board, a big armoured bulkhead all covered in guns. In the lore, they're well known for their particularly powerful grav impact field, which is part of the reason why they have their namesake, able to physically smash enemies away from them and crush luckless infantry under the sheer weight of their grav treads. Models wise, they have two different variants, the standard Repulsor, which is more the heavily armoured transport variant to my mind, and then the big nasty Repulsor Executioner that's more of a very heavy main primary battle tank. The standard one is £57, €72 or $92 from Games Workshop, which I think, given Games Workshop pricing, maybe isn't the absolute worst for a vehicle of its size. It's the same price as a few vehicles like Gladiator tanks or Exorcists, which has always felt a bit weird, mainly because they're kind of expensive. It just seems excessive pricing for them as significantly smaller vehicles. They do charge more for the Repulsor Executioner though. The big gun will cost you £71.50, $115 or €90. Maybe a little bit unfortunate though, given that they're on the same chassis and they're just kind of charging the extra amount for the really big primary gun. Points per dollar wise, unfortunately neither of them are particularly amazing, just under 2 points per dollar at the moment, in line with a bunch of Space Marine things, though not particularly great in comparison with the rest of 40k. Miniature wise, I'd say that the Repulsor is maybe a kit that divides opinions a little bit more than some in 40k, certainly not absolutely universally loved. The criticisms when it came out were mainly that it just lacked a bit of focus, at least for the primary variant, having a slightly crazy amount of guns that jut off it at all sorts of different angles. It's covered in stubbers, hull-mounted weapons, turret and pintle-mounted things, and a lot of grenade launcher type things on the sides. Personally, out of the two, I think I do prefer the look of the Executioner. I think that the big primary weapon actually draws a lot more focus to it and makes it look like an overall more standard battle tank. Given that the two share a chassis, I'd be kind of tempted to potentially go for the Repulsor Executioner of the two and then do a bit of hobby work to try and make it so you can magnetize between the two variants. It certainly isn't super simple though, you need to acquire some other bits and do a bit of work on the turrets to make sure that you could swap out. Though I think if you're motivated then it's doable and the hobby work is probably worth it on balance given the expense of these. As ever, of course, if you were looking to pick one up, I'd certainly recommend going by discount retailers first. There are a fair bunch of them linked down in the video description that help support the channel. Depending on where you are in the world, it can be anywhere between 10 and 20% off Games Workshop's March prices, and certainly not the worst idea to use that versus their web store when you buy models as big and expensive as this one. In any case, a big thank you to you guys who are using those when you do happen to pick up miniatures anyway. Let's jump into the datasheet though, and we'll start off with the regular Repulsor. As per the recent data slate, they're now 180 points, down from 190, and I think that that's the cheapest the regular Repulsor has ever been in game. For that I think you get a fairly respectable stat line, 10-inch movement, and a big toughness 12 wound 16 vehicle. The standard variant is genuinely very tanky for the cost now. Though with a 3+ save and no invulnerable or 2+ armor save, it does mean that high AP, high damage anti-tank weapons will chew through the profile just a little bit easier than you might hope for. Anything that you'd expect to be good against a tank absolutely is against this. It doesn't have as much mitigation as a few other units do. It's certainly still going to draw a fair bit of fire though. It takes around about 9ish las cannon hits to down one of these, so we'll take out a fair bit of enemy shooting, depending a little bit on whether or not it gets cover. Otherwise, it's got a nice objective control 5, so it can definitely chip into midfield objectives while it's done transporting, and has the smoke keyword, which sometimes can be a good option compared with Armour of Contempt. Its melee also actually has a little bit of threat, with 6 attacks at strength 8, AP 0 and damage 1, so can roadkill a couple of enemies under those grav plates. And in the balance update, the tank shock got quite a lot better. Previously it would have often been tank shocking at 10 dice, and now it'll be 12 even against hard targets. For its weaponry, all of its small guns are consolidated into the single profile Repulsor defensive array, which are a fairly straightforward 18 shots at anything within 24 inches, Really quite nice not to have to allocate every single grenade launcher and stubber like you used to. That's certainly a helpful bit of volume fire to thin out enemy hordes. It gets a fun and fairly punchy indirect fire Hunter Slayer missile, hitting at strength 14, AP3 and damage D6, that will only be hitting on a 4+ post data slate despite its 2+ unless you fire it directly. Still quite a nice random chance to cause a big impact on something. And then there's basically a primary and secondary weapon option. You either have the Heavy Onslaught Gatling Cannon versus the Last Talon, so that's 12 devastating wound shots versus 2 strength 10 AP3 damage D6 plus 1 ones. I feel like that's not an outright win for one or the other, though I think I'd probably go for the Heavy Onslaught myself. I think I could happily go either way on that one though, and then on the whole you've either got the option of a twin Heavy Bolter or a twin Las Cannon. I think for that one I'd be more tempted by the twin Las Cannon overall. Unless you literally just want a vehicle that's going all out for anti-infantry firepower, you could have a fairly crazy 33 shots coming out of this thing if you had a mind to. Overall, at 180 points, its damage output I still don't think is spectacular. It is more of a heavy transport than it is a tank, though it really does good work against anything that's say toughness 4 or less hordes with that defensive array. It's just not going to be very much of a threat against enemy heavier targets compared with lots of competitors. Then we've got the transport capacity, which was upgraded as per the latest balance update. You now have 14 models there. Really quite a bulky hold, and the difference that makes is that you can now have something like 6 aggressors plus an attached character, or 6 eradicators with an attached character if you'd like. There's a few other things that could theoretically matter, I suppose things like Deathwatch Proteus kill teams perhaps, but otherwise they feel like the biggest differences of that capacity. Quite nice to get an expanded transport capacity in addition to a points cut as well. It does feel like Space Marines have plenty of units that could potentially use that pretty well. Things that go heavier into their damage output versus defense, things like Hellblasters or Eradicators who also need to get close. Aggressors would absolutely fit into that bill as well, though they might have some temptation with a Land Raider for them, given that they might want to charge too. But in theory, all sorts of units could potentially use it, anything from Stern Guard to Blade Guard to Sword Brethren or others. Given its special rule, it perhaps favours shooting units a little bit more than melee units, and might be a bit more tempting to look at for anything that you can't fit into a cheaper Impulsor if you just want a unit to do the transport job. Otherwise, if you want melee units, then you might be a bit more tempted by Land Raiders with the Assault Ramp. Talking of that special rule though, that's Emergency Combat Embarkation. This one is a sort of melee defense type rule, basically meaning that when the repulsor gets charged, if the charge target was within embarkation range of the repulsor, it means it could immediately get back into the transport, and that's kind of disruptive for melee armies out there. In theory, you could be dropping a big scary range squad like Eradicators or Hellblasters out the front of it, unload all their damage output into the enemy army, and then if the only way that they can deal with you is to charge you, then you can suddenly embark back inside the repulsor's armor plating. And that just could be quite disruptive if the melee unit is something that was good against infantry things but not really all that great against a great big tank. Even if the repulsor is killed, then it potentially means that the unit could disembark somewhere to safety and get in another round of scary shooting against whatever killed it. Otherwise though, taking a look at the gun tank variant of the repulsor, we've got the Repulsor Executioner. This one's significantly more in cost now at 220 points, a little bit more of a points differential than it was. Though certainly in competitive play, the Repulsor Executioners were played more than the regular variant before. This one gets the same basic profile, but trades out for a bunch of different firepower. And it still has some transport capacity, having 6 models that can embark, and that could still be pretty opportunistically useful, having a scary shooting threat unit inside it, something like 3 Eradicators or 5 Hellblasters perhaps. If playing it an Ironstorm Spearhead though, they were more commonly run empty. Even besides the main gun though, the Repulsor Executioner comes with a fair few more weapon profiles than the regular one. The Repulsor defensive array is only 10 shots rather than 18, but that's still quite a lot of volume fire, and then beyond that it gets a twin heavy bolter and a heavy onslaught Gatling cannon, so basically the anti-horde variants that you could put on the regular Repulsor profile. And then on top of that it gets a twin Iron Hail heavy stubber, a regular Iron Hail heavy stubber, and an Icarus rocket pod. And between those lot, they easily make up for any shortfall on the defensive array. Potentially that's an extra 14 shots within 18-inch range. Its special rule is a firepower one as well, which can come in handy every so often. If you get to target an enemy unit that's below half strength, then you add +1 to the hit roll. Though on average in 40k you're more likely to be targeting things that are above half strength versus below, but I suppose it gives it just a little bit extra oomph with scything down the last few infantry units in depleted squads, I guess. Then though, it gets a big exciting primary weapon, and this one feels like the main thing that you're paying the extra points for, so 40 points extra for this profile. Either a Macroplasma Incinerator, the same one as the Redemptor Dreadnought, d6 plus 1 shots at 36 inches, strength 9, AP 4, damage 3, blast and hazardous, or the Heavy Laser Destroyer, which gives you 2 shots at 72 inches, strength 16, AP 4, and a big damage d6 plus 4. And that one gets the heavy keyword, so you're hitting on a 2+ with that if you can remain stationary. This is the rough damage output that you can expect if the tank is on the move. Unsurprisingly, the overcharged plasma does better against the heavy infantry, slaying around about 3 Space Marines or a bit more than 1 Terminator, whereas the Heavy Laser Destroyer is a big threat to more heavily armoured things, doing better against toughness 9 things like rhinos, and significantly better against really big heavy targets like enemy land raiders. Overall, between the two in the competitive game, the Heavy Laser Destroyer tends to get played more than the Macroplasma. I think you could maybe argue that it rounds the tank out a bit more, given the Heavy Onslaught Gatling Cannon plus the Heavy Bolter can do a bit against heavy infantry, whereas otherwise if you don't have the Laser Destroyer it's not really all that big a threat against tough stuff. But I feel like both of the profiles are useful, and if you've got lots of anti-armor covered, then the Macroplasma really isn't that bad. As per previous videos, here's the rough damage output versus a few competitors for the Repulsor Executioner. The Laser Destroyer isn't quite as fearsome as the Gladiator Lancer with its inbuilt rerolls, though if you're playing an Ironstorm Spearhead or have Oath of Moment or the +1 to hit on your target, then any of those will narrow the gap quite considerably. And in reality, a fair bit of the time it's going to make sense to split fire with its secondary weapons. Just throw the main gun into your big enemy anti-tank type target, and then put all the anti-horde shots into enemy infantry if there's ones worth shooting. Otherwise, for durability numbers, it doesn't do too badly here either. Generally a bit better versus strength 10 or strength 12 stuff versus its competitors, seeing as its big win is the high toughness that it gets. Maybe not as great comparatively versus mid-strength stuff like Plasma and Melter, which will still be wounding it on 5s just like the rest, and in this particular comparison the Ballistus wins out. Overall though, I think both of the tanks have good stuff going for them. The standard Repulsor is genuinely quite tough for the cost at 180 points with the 16 wounds at toughness 12. Its damage output I'd say is okay but a bit limited. It's generally going to be pretty strong against enemy horde type targets, but not really all that good against enemy armoured things. I feel like its transport capacity has its role, with Hellblasters, Eradicators, and maybe Aggressors being quite nice, but definitely having competition on that front from things like Land Raiders to deliver melee, or Impulsors for anything that can fit inside that transport. It certainly seems like an interesting choice in Firestorm though, as we'll get on to. Otherwise, the Repulsor Executioner is an entirely different battlefield role, far more used as just a primary gun tank and damage dealer. The damage and defensive numbers seem to hold out pretty well versus its competitors, and maybe one of its main advantages is a big central focal unit where you can get good advantage out of things like Tech Marine +1 to hits or any stratagems that you have. And compared with a few of its gun tank competitors, you do have more shots to clear infantry than them. They do have a very impressive rate of volume fire, so again good against hordes, and still not a threat that heavies can ignore while that laser destroyer is on the table. It does maybe mean that any seriously massive enemy anti-tank guns, like enemy say Gladiator Lancers or Tau railguns or anything like that, will have this as an absolutely great target for them. Its special rule feels a bit weak, and maybe its big hull can be a bit of an issue, sometimes not always being able to fit between narrow gaps around the table, and might give it just a little bit more trouble hiding than some of its smaller competitors. For unit support, as really big central units for both of them, they can both have a lot of interest for any Space Marine supporting rules, things like Oath of Moment stratagems or other units on the field. Oath of Moment's always handy, and I feel like both units get a whole load of value out of that, particularly if the Repulsor Executioner has to move. Always good for some focal firepower, and they can also use any other Space Marine buffing units that can mark one target for big effects, things like the Storm Speeder Thunderstrikes +1 to wound, the +1 to hit from Incursors, or maybe things like Combi Weapon Lieutenants marking extra damage on the mid-board objectives. For stratagems, Armour of Contempt is really big on these, given how big their defensive stat lines are. If they're in a position where they've just threatened and destroyed something, and then the enemy's going to try and hit them back, if they can both be in cover and also with Armour of Contempt, then unless you've got really good AP, then they're probably not going to get shot down too easily. Between cover and that stratagem, it means that you could potentially be saving AP3 things on a 4+ still, which is fairly good odds. Otherwise, as mentioned, tank shot got better, on averaging around about 4 mortal wounds when you charge. Could be okay in a pinch, maybe for late game objective pushing. Smoke is a solid option compared with Armor of Contempt for -1 to hit if they're out of cover for any reason. You basically get the bonus to your save and also -1 to hit, so better there situationally. And the command point reroll is probably worth a shout as well for the Repulsor Executioner's main cannon. If you fail an unexpected wound roll on the laser destroyer against something that's got a 3+ armor save or something like that, then it's probably going to be worth the reroll. Particularly if a pass roll will average you d6 plus 4 damage, that's going to make a big impact. Finally, and perhaps particularly for the Repulsor Executioner, they pair really well with Tech Marines. They're one of the biggest and scariest Space Marine vehicles that they can support with the +1 to hit and the repairs that they can give. And for 55 points, I feel like if you got one of these, then you can probably justify a Tech Marine, though it probably wants to be in a list with multiple vehicles, so you've got something to fall back on and use the Tech Marine buffs on if the enemy does manage to gun down a Repulsor Executioner. For Space Marine detachments, really quite a lot of them get at least something interesting for one or the other. Perhaps the single most obvious is Ironstorm Spearhead with vehicle type units. In particular, the Repulsor Executioner is really favoured there. That heavy laser destroyer gets on really well with re-rolling a single wound dice, and that's one advantage to running it versus the Gladiator Lancer that likely already has the re-rolls it needs. Any of the Tech Marine boosts can help it out here. They got worse in the latest balance data slate, unfortunately, though I still think that the Repulsor Executioner is maybe one of the best focal targets. Anything that affects just one unit now is going to be far more important to have on a really big scary tank. And it still maybe feels like one of the units that you can justify Mercier's weakness on to just utterly wail on an enemy unit in the midboard, potentially getting sustained and lethal hits on a 5+, and then re-rolling everything with Oath of Moment. It's going to be stacking a whole bunch of saves at a variety of profiles. There's good support otherwise though. The Return Fire stratagem is very nice if it gets taken down to half health, and again massive to get an entire Repulsor Executioner's worth of firepower for 1 CP. Auto explodes on a d6 could be situationally big as well if it goes down and there's loads of enemy units around it. Otherwise though, a few of the other detachments maybe might favour the regular Repulsor, particularly the Firestorm Assault Force seems great for that. Advance and Shoot is definitely handy for something venturing into the midboard, and the +1 strength is actually really pretty nasty with the defensive array. Going up to strength 5 is handy for that, and then probably above and beyond that, you've got far more interest for the units being transported by it. You could be having strength 10 Eradicators jump out if they're within 12 inches, and potentially doing so in reaction to enemies shooting with Burning Vengeance. And I've got an additional option to re-embark in the transport, meaning that they could do so if they're charged or just if they feel like it, with the Land Raider Redeemer taking a big points bump and making that a bit less desirable for this detachment. The Repulsors might have a bit more of a look in than they did before. Otherwise though, the standard Repulsor could be pretty good in the Gladius Task Force too, where you can advance and shoot, and fall back and shoot is pretty good for both variants of it. And the regular Repulsor could be an interesting option to deliver a fire discipline combo. If you wanted big all-in transported danger, you could have 10 Hellblasters plus a lieutenant in there with that, and deliver them with a Repulsor, and then guard them from being charged with its special rule. The Storm of Fire stratagem could be just nice for a Repulsor in general, to be fair. I say that there may be some of the more standout things, though lots of other detachments have at least something interesting for them. Vanguard getting -1 to hit and cover at long range is fairly nice, and you could support shooting infantry with it. And Anvil has a few interesting options. You could get a +1 to wound laser destroyer for the Executioner, which seems scary, and there's stratagems for sustained hits, anti-tank rerolls, and falling back as well. Again, a Repulsor Executioner feels like it's more at home here, and perhaps is one of the units that's got a bit more reliability with sitting out in the open, maybe robust enough to take a round of firepower or two. Finally, some chapters could have some interest as well. Dark Angels have the Landspeeder Darkshroud for the -1 to hit and the cover save. That's often used on Storm Ravens. Though given another points increase to that, it could be a bit more tempting on Repulsor Executioners instead perhaps. They do have a few other shooting related other detachments like Advance and Shoot in their Raven Wing one, and a few interesting ones for them in the Unforgiven task force. The Black Templar variants can get Feel No Pain and Bolt-on multi-melters. I've certainly seen people using the Repulsor Executioner for the 15-point multi-melter upgrade, though I feel like the standard Repulsor is maybe more of a negative now that you have to pay 20 points for it, unfortunately. Deathwatch could get some interesting extra damage buffs with Black Spear, particularly the Tome of Ectoclades for some nice wound rerolls, as well as their turn-by-turn stuff. It could be an interesting option to deliver some kill team combos as well. You could have a 3 Terminator Proteus kill team inside a Repulsor's armoured hull, and they can be very shooty indeed between cyclone missile launchers and frag cannons and things. I feel like Blood Angels and Space Wolves are probably going to be looking at Land Raiders first, or Repulsors perhaps for Death Company or Assault Intercessors charging out of. Maybe a little bit less obvious core synergy. They feel like they're not really all that suboptimal still. If you just wanted one as a big staging post and you didn't fancy shelling out for the 2+ save and the Assault Ramp rule for the Land Raider, I still think they're certainly usable. Talking of tournament use, I was kind of interested to see how many army lists Repulsors tended to crop up in previously. I took a look at a bunch of Ironstorm lists that had done well in tournaments to count how many had Repulsor Executioners in them. It does look like it's a fairly positive amount. 9 out of the 16 of them featured at least one Repulsor Executioner, usually armed with the heavy laser destroyer, and the ones that didn't tended to swap them out for excessive amounts of gladiators or maybe a Storm Raven gunship or two. This was all pre-Dataslate, so certainly since then the Ironstorm Spearhead has been nerfed in general, but if you are still going to be running Ironstorm in one way or another, I feel like the Repulsor Executioner seems like it's gained significant ground on a few of the other competitors. Things like Storm Ravens, Gladiator Reapers and Gladiator Valiants all went up in cost, as did the Land Raider Redeemer if you're using those, so it feels like for armies that are using Ironstorm, the proportion of them that might choose to take a Repulsor Executioner along seems likely to go up, if anything. Otherwise, the regular Repulsor previously rarely saw too much play, unfortunately, in competitive lists. I personally don't really think because it was a terrible unit, but more due to having its glory stolen a bit by the Land Raider Redeemer in particular, which was one of the strongest Space Marine units. It's still a massive threat with some big armor and huge overwatch in the midfield, but now it's gone up 25 points to 185 points. You are paying a lot more of a premium for that. It's now 105 points more than the Repulsor, and feels like some people could genuinely be tempted by the standard Repulsor in the choice between the two. The transport capacity increase in Firestorm seems relevant as well. Getting 6 aggressors or 6 eradicators with an attached character seems a big win there, and it seems similar in Gladius as well. You could have 6 aggressors with Fire Discipline and the Apothecary Biologist, and if you compare the loss of the Assault Ramp, that could be interesting. Overall, at the moment, it looks like the Primaris Horror Fortresses haven't done too terribly in the context of the Space Marine army. I feel like both of them are easily strong enough to hold their own in casual play, and seem usable enough to justify most detachments, even if they're probably not optimal in a fair few of them. The Repulsor certainly feels like it's risen up the tier rankings in the Firestorm, given the points decrease, transport capacity increase, and nerf of the Land Raider Redeemer. And if you're playing Ironstorm, I feel like the Repulsor Executioner is looking like a more tempting choice than ever there, though obviously Ironstorm did take some big nerfs and is a weaker detachment than it used to be overall. For use in game, for the Repulsor Executioner, as mentioned, I'd likely go for the Laser Destroyer and having Tech Marines in support. As a big centerpiece gun tank, ideally you want to play pretty carefully with it, not having it just destroyed by enemy firepower before it gets to strike, and hopefully being able to hide behind terrain as a high priority and then move out to hit the enemy armor if it looks like it's got some scary firepower on the other side of the board, and is a particularly good target for any focal buffs, whether they're things like Tech Marine enhancements or damage or defense stratagems like Armor of Contempt or Smoke. I think the trick with them is probably going to be to know when to push up the board and know when to hold back. As big centerpiece units, you really don't want them destroyed too early, but at the same time you can't really afford to have them just sit back and fire all game while the opponent scores all the objectives. If the opponent's playing more KG or in the mid to late game, they're going to need to play more aggressive, move up the boards to gain line of sight, and take down enemy infantry units with all of those defensive weapons. Otherwise, for the regular Repulsor, I think it's pretty interesting as a sort of medium value, big tough transport. I think it is cheap for its defensive profile, that doesn't really quite contribute as much threat to the damage game as things like the Land Raider Redeemer. Kind of an interesting halfway choice between super cheap Impulsors to get units around, or big investment Land Raiders. I think overall it's probably best in things like Firestorm to deliver all manner of close range shooting, or Fire Discipline combos in Gladius, and likely needs to be scrapping with the enemy on the front line after it's fulfilled its transport duties, aiming to get its scary squad into battle, hopefully defend them against enemy charges if that's relevant, and then get all of its vast amount of shots to work on enemy infantry type units, potentially following up with nuisance charges and tank shocks if it makes sense. In any case, let me know your thoughts on the Repulsor variants, how would you rate them in game right now, and have you been putting them on the table in 10th edition? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep up the regular 40k videos. There'll certainly be plenty more for the Space Marines in the future. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all the videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with the chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.